15 kilometers south of Tel Aviv, there's a facility that makes more drinking water from the open sea more cheaply than almost anywhere else on Earth has ever managed. 624,000 cubic meters of it every single day. Enough for roughly 1.5 million people, produced from water nobody can drink. And here's the part that should genuinely bother you once you understand it. Nature does not want this to happen. Freshwater and saltwater do not want to separate. Left alone, they do the exact opposite. They mix, and they mix with a physical force strong enough to burst a sealed pipe. Making seawater drinkable isn't a filtering problem. It's an arm wrestling match against a real, measurable physical law. And for most of the 20th century, that law was winning so decisively that desalination stayed a rich country's luxury, not a national water strategy. Something changed at this specific site, on this specific project, and it wasn't a single miracle invention. It was about 6 separate engineering decisions, each one solving a problem the last one created, stacking together into the cheapest large-scale seawater desalination plant on the planet. Welcome back to Grand Structures. This is the first video in a new series on the real engineering behind Israel's desalination plants, and we're starting with Sorek, because Sorek is the plant that made everyone else in this industry rewrite their numbers. Let's start with the law of physics this entire facility exists to defeat. Take a container, split it in half with a membrane that lets water through but blocks salt, and put fresh water on one side and salt water on the other. What happens next isn't intuitive unless you've seen it. Water moves on its own, with no pump, no energy input, from the fresh side toward the salty side. Nature is trying to dilute the salt water, and it will keep pulling fresh water across that membrane until the concentrations even out, or until something physically stops it. That something is pressure, and the amount of pressure it takes to stop this pulling force has a name: osmotic pressure. For ordinary seawater, at roughly 3.5% salinity, that number works out to about 27 to 28 bar. Call it nearly 400 pounds pressing on every square inch. That's the wall. Not a physical wall you could see or touch, but a thermodynamic one, exactly as real, exactly as immovable unless you push back harder than it's pushing. And here's the move that makes desalination possible at all. If plain osmosis pulls fresh water into salt water, then pushing on the saltwater side with more force than that 27 bar wall reverses the direction entirely. Fresh water gets forced backward, out of the seawater, through the membrane, into a stream of actual drinkable water. That's the entire concept behind the name reverse osmosis. You're not filtering salt out in the way a coffee filter catches grounds. You're overpowering a law of thermodynamics with brute mechanical force. But overpowering a 27 bar wall isn't a small ask. In practice, plants don't just barely clear that threshold. They push feed water to roughly 60 to 70 bar, more than double the minimum, because you need margin to actually drive a useful flow rate through the membrane, not just balance the scales. That's pressure equivalent to what you'd find roughly 600 to 700 meters underwater, generated at sea level by machines continuously for years. This is the foundational fact this entire video is built on. Every gallon of drinking water Sorek produces requires physically overpowering a thermodynamic pressure wall. At every major system in this plant, the membranes, the pumps, the energy recovery hardware, even the shape of the pressure vessels exists because of the engineering problem that one requirement creates. Before we get to how Sorek pushes water through that wall, it's worth understanding what the water is actually being pushed through, because the membrane itself is doing something remarkable at a scale most people never think about. A reverse osmosis membrane at Sorek is a thin film composite, a microscopically thin, dense polymer layer thinner than a human hair, laminated onto a stronger support structure underneath it purely for physical strength. That top layer is the part doing the actual work, and its pores are small enough to be measured in fractions of a nanometer.
small enough to let a water molecule pass through, essentially one at a time, while rejecting more than 99.5% of dissolved salt ions, along with bacteria, viruses, and virtually everything else dissolved or suspended in seawater. Here's the requirement that creates the next 3 sections of this video. A membrane working at that resolution is also extraordinarily easy to ruin. Any suspended particle, any trace of biological growth, any speck of silt gets trapped on that surface and starts choking flow through it, a phenomenon called fouling. And once fouling starts on a membrane running continuously for years, it doesn't reverse itself. It gets worse, kills your flow rate, and eventually kills the membrane. Which means Sorek can never simply pump raw Mediterranean seawater full of algae, silt, and microorganisms directly at these membranes. Everything upstream of the membrane hull exists purely to protect that microscopic polymer layer from the ordinary reality of what seawater actually contains. Sorek draws its raw seawater through an open intake system connected to the plant using pipe jacking, tunneling large-diameter pipelines underground rather than trenching an open cut across the beach and seafloor. It's a construction choice with a direct engineering payoff. The shoreline stays intact, marine habitat disruption at the intake point is minimized, and the pipeline sits protected below grade rather than exposed to wave action and storm damage. The same pipe jacking method is used again later on the discharge side for exactly the same reasons. Once that raw seawater arrives, it passes through dual media gravity filters, beds of sand and anthracite, coal, layered by particle size, letting seawater filter downward through progressively finer material under nothing more than gravity. No high-pressure pumping required at this stage. This step strips out suspended solids, algae, and larger organic material before a single drop reaches an actual membrane. This is a deliberately lighter touch pre-treatment strategy than some competing plants use, and it matters because chemical dosing has its own costs, reagents, waste streams, and ongoing operating expense. By relying on physical, gravity-driven filtration rather than heavy chemical pre-treatment, Sorek keeps both its chemical consumption and its long-term operating cost down, while still protecting the membranes downstream. Every dollar not spent neutralizing a fouling problem before it starts is a dollar that stays out of the final price of every cubic meter of water.
Now we get to the part of the plant that actually determines whether this whole operation is affordable or not, because pushing seawater to 60+ bar continuously at over 600,000 cubic meters a day is a genuinely enormous power draw. Historically, this is exactly where desalination died as an economic idea. Plants built before modern energy recovery consumed 8 to 10 kilowatt-hours of electricity for every cubic meter of fresh water they produced. Here's the detail that explains why that number was so brutal. When seawater is forced through the membrane, only part of it becomes fresh water, usually somewhere around 40 to 50% at these salinity levels. The rest exits as brine, more concentrated than it went in, and critically still carrying almost all of the pressure energy you just spent enormous electricity generating. If you simply discharge that brine, you are throwing away most of the energy you paid for. The device that fixes this is called a pressure exchanger, and the way it works is genuinely elegant. Picture a rotor full of parallel ducts spinning at roughly 1,200 revolutions per minute inside a sealed housing. On one side of that rotor, high-pressure brine flows in. On the other side, low-pressure incoming seawater flows in. As the rotor spins, each duct briefly connects the two streams directly, and for a fraction of a second, the high-pressure brine and the low-pressure feed water sit in direct contact inside the same duct. Pressure equalizes almost instantly across that contact. Physics doesn't care which fluid is which, it just wants pressure balanced, and the incoming feed water leaves that duct already carrying most of the brine's original pressure before the rotor spins the duct away and the small mixed interface between the two fluids gets flushed out as part of the reject stream. That's the entire trick.
Rather than converting pressure into electricity and back into pressure again, losing energy at every conversion, the device transfers pressure directly, fluid to fluid, mechanically. Modern versions of this hardware run at 94 to 98% efficiency, and at Sorek, the reported energy recovery rate is above 90%. Combined with a pressure center design that groups high-pressure pumps and recovery devices together for maximum hydraulic efficiency, this single piece of engineering is the reason Sorek's specific energy consumption sits in the range of roughly 3 to 4 kilowatt-hours per cubic meter, less than half of what an equivalent plant would have needed before this technology existed, and creeping up against a thermodynamic minimum for seawater at this salinity of somewhere around 0.86 to 1 kilowatt-hour per cubic meter. Sorek isn't close to that theoretical floor. Nobody is yet, but it's the closest large-scale plant has gotten. There's one more structural decision at Sorek worth understanding on its own, because it looks like a minor design choice, and it isn't. The plant uses 16-inch pressure vessels arranged vertically, when the entire industry standard before Sorek was 8-inch vessels laid horizontally. The physical logic runs like this. A wider vessel holds more membrane elements per unit, which means fewer individual vessels, less connecting pipework, and fewer pipe joints, and every joint and every meter of pipe is a source of friction, a point of pressure loss, and a place water has to be pushed through mechanically rather than doing useful desalting work. Standing those wider vessels vertically instead of laying them horizontally then shrinks the physical footprint of the entire membrane hull, meaning less real estate, less structural steel, and shorter pipe runs between components. The combined effect isn't dramatic in any single measurement. It's a percentage point here, a percentage point there, in reduced pressure losses, reduced piping cost, and reduced land footprint. But desalination economics live and die on exactly these kinds of marginal gains, compounded across a plant running continuously for 25 years. This is the unglamorous engineering that doesn't get a headline of its own, but shows up directly in the final price per cubic meter. Here's a problem that has nothing to do with pressure or pumps at all, and it comes from the chemistry of one specific element, boron. Boron is naturally present in seawater, and in that environment it mostly exists as boric acid, a neutral, uncharged molecule rather than an ion. That distinction matters enormously to a reverse osmosis membrane, because these membranes are far better at rejecting charged ions, which get repelled electrically by the membrane surface, than they are at rejecting small, neutral molecules that are close in size and shape to water itself. Boric acid slips through standard seawater reverse osmosis membranes far more easily than sodium ions or chloride ions do. That would normally just be an inconvenient footnote, except boron is toxic to a wide range of crops at concentrations that are otherwise harmless to humans, a serious problem for a country like Israel, where desalinated water is blended directly into agricultural irrigation supply. The standard being engineered for here is bringing boron down below 0.3 milligrams per liter, low enough to be safe for boron-sensitive crops like citrus. The fix is a second pass of chemistry rather than brute filtration. Raising the pH of the water shifts boric acid's chemical equilibrium, converting a meaningful share of it from that neutral, hard-to-reject molecule into borate, a negatively charged ion. And a charged ion is exactly what a reverse osmosis membrane is built to reject. Sorek's boron removal system uses this pH shift approach, running a dedicated stage specifically to change boron's chemical identity into a form the membrane can actually stop, rather than trying to filter out a molecule that was never going to behave. It's a small detail in the overall plant, and it's also a perfect example of the philosophy running through this entire facility. Every problem here gets solved by understanding the underlying chemistry or physics precisely enough to work with it, not around it.
Everything the membranes reject leaves the plant as brine, a roughly double the salinity of ordinary seawater and still under pressure until the energy recovery stage claims most of that pressure back. What's left is discharged back into the Mediterranean through that same pipe-jacked outfall system, engineered with diffusers designed to mix and dilute the brine rapidly, rather than letting a dense hypersaline plume settle undiluted along the seafloor near the outfall. This is the quiet, ongoing engineering trade-off sitting underneath every desalination plant on Earth. You can solve the freshwater side of this equation extremely well, but you're still returning a concentrated version of the sea to the sea, and the long-term marine impact of that return stream is a genuinely active area of monitoring and research, including work looking at whether valuable dissolved minerals in that brine like magnesium, lithium, and bromine could eventually be recovered rather than simply discharged. Right now at Sorek, dilution and monitoring is the answer. Whether extraction becomes the answer at scale is still an open engineering question, and it's one we'll come back to later in this series. Here's what I actually want you to walk away from this video with, and it's not a single fact about one plant. It's the shape of how a genuinely hard physical constraint gets defeated in the real world. Not through one miracle breakthrough, but through 6 separate unglamorous engineering decisions, each one addressing a problem the last one created. Overpowering osmotic pressure with high-pressure pumps, protecting a delicate membrane with gravity filtration, recovering that pressure energy instead of wasting it, shrinking the plant's footprint with a change in vessel geometry, outthinking boron's chemistry instead of fighting it, and returning what's left to the sea as carefully as the intake removed it in the first place. None of those 6 ideas individually is revolutionary. Pressure exchangers existed before Sorek. Vertical vessels existed before Sorek. What Sorek actually did was stack every one of these incremental gains into a single facility at a scale nobody had built before, and the result was a bid price around $0.58 per cubic meter, a number that rewrote what governments around the world believed desalinated water was allowed to cost. So here's a real question worth sitting with as this series continues. If the last major breakthrough here wasn't one big invention, but the compounding of a dozen small ones, where does the next real gain actually come from? Better membranes closing the remaining gap to that thermodynamic floor? Cheaper renewable power feeding these pumps? Or is the next Sorek simply going to be someone doing this exact same thing again, more precisely at even bigger scale? Let me know what you think in the comments. Next episode in this series, we're going inside Sorek 2, the plant Sorek's own success forced into existence and the one that pushed this price even lower. Subscribe to Grand Structures. We'll see you in the next breakdown.